Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Nacho with the Nacho Show here live from Ogden, Utah. And today we have a really nice show going on today. And we want to talk about Biden wants oil from Venezuela. What the heck, right? This and much more we will have here at the Nacho Show. Let's start. Hey, thank you so much, everybody, for being here today. You are watching the Nacho Show, and I want to let you know that this show is being sponsored by Solidify Web. Let's build a website for you today. And we have another sponsor, which is Nacho Graphics and nachographics.com, and we will bring a fantastic design for you and your business. Also, you want to know about how to secure the vote? Go to securevoteutah.org. You'll find more information. And today we have a really nice guest with us today. He's been with us before, and because we like him so much, then yeah, it's definitely fantastic to have him here. His name is Alex Duran. How you doing, Alex?
Doing great, Nacho. Happy to be here with you again. Thank you for inviting me.
That's fantastic. Well, thanks so much for accepting this invitation. And the topic of today is going to be quite surprising. Quite surprising because of the Joe Biden administration wants to lift the sanctions to Venezuela in order to bring oil into the United States. And it's definitely surprising because, well, as you and I know, the United States has brought so many sanctions to Venezuela that I mean, we're basically enemies. And maybe you will be able to clarify that a little bit. And I don't know, it just seems very bizarre, how now we really want to be buddy buddy with Venezuela. Because before, we were like enemies. And you may be able to clarify this also. Venezuela, they are super buddy buddy with Russia as well, which Russia is, well, kind of like also not very friendly, to the United States. And another thing that I really want to talk about is China. I mean, I'm not so worried. I don't know. And this is just my humble opinion. I don't think I am super worried about Russia, but the ones that make me very nervous is China and the harm that can cause to the world and everything that they're currently doing. So, and like I said, folks, we have Alex Duran. I don't know, for some odd reason, I thought that your last name was Duarte.
It happens.
I'm sure you get that a lot, but
Yeah.
anyway, well, the first question of today, just so we can go ahead and elaborate a little bit. Talk to us a little bit of a history of the relationship between Venezuela and the United States. And after that, I want to talk about Citgo and the relationship that it has with the gas and oil industry in the U.S. So yeah, could you elaborate a little bit on the history for us?
Sure. I'll be happy to. I do have to say I'm not by any means an expert on all of these, and I don't have all the facts, but I can definitely provide, I guess, some highlights or an outline of what it has been and kind of where we are right now. So uh, I do have to say, and on your in your introduction, you touch on many points that have a lot to unpack. Um, so but I guess I'll start with the Venezuelan relationship with the United States. If we go back, both the United States and Venezuela are relatively young countries. Um, and from the very very beginning, the development of Venezuela as a country has been very close to the
Hmm.
development of the United States as a country as well.
Right.
So over I'm out there to say over a period of 150, 100, almost 200 years, the Venezuela has increasingly been closer to the U.S. With
Uh-huh.
some very, some low notes during that time, at the beginning of the 20th century, for example. But I guess more specifically after the 1920s, when the oil production started in Venezuela, you could see, a closer relationship going on there. There were many things. One of them was just the commercial relationship. There were the reason the oil industry was able to develop and flourish in Venezuela was due in great part to the work of American companies that were there, had the know-how, had the technology, and had the manpower, to get this done, and that actually helped create a very, I guess, symbiotic relationship between Venezuela and the U.S. During after during World War II, for example, Venezuela, as uh, just like the rest of Latin America, actually got to kind of got closer to the U.S. because of kind of a thing having to do with the perceived threat from Germany on World War II.
Uh-huh.
That's when you see, for example, that you see the Organization of American States. You see, that there are treaties in place that will guarantee that we would kind of like work together if there was such a threat coming towards our hemisphere, and all of that. But this is way back in the 40s.
Uh-huh.
um, and when it comes to, unfortunately, once we get to the late 20th century and Chavez comes aboard, obviously many things have happened during that period of time in Latin America. There were certain decisions that people can debate about on the U.S. foreign policy that
Hmm.
kind of like um, angered some people in Latin America, and you do see a very very strong pull towards the left. And
Yeah.
on that pull towards the left, you kind of see, and you can see how this played out during the Cold War, right? When you have, for example, an element like Cuba having such close ties with the Soviet Union, and everything that pretty much emanated from Cuba, has been, I would argue, has been a very destabilizing factor in Latin America. Venezuela was not impervious to that. Um, Hugo Chavez,
Hmm.
well, I mean, Fidel Castro always wanted to have a hand in Venezuela. Just Venezuela is geopolitically is a very, very strategic place to have control over, and he didn't like how close it was to the U.S. But he did certainly like the access to money and power that Venezuela could make available to him. He was unsuccessful in getting his hands on Venezuela during the 60s,
Hmm.
but then he did start working and doing the kind of work that they're very good at doing, which is long term. It's long term work.
Hmm.
There's a lot of indoctrination, a lot of sending. Whenever you hear that Cubans are sending doctors and they're sending
Yeah.
teachers and all of that, because you
For
always hear
free.
this, you always
For
hear that.
free.
Yes, I was like, oh, the U.S. exports war, but Cuba exports health and education. Well, not really. So, but you know that kind of got its, I guess, an inflection, got to an inflection point once Chavez got to power.
Uh-huh.
Chavez saw in Fidel Castro this amazing figure that could kind of like mentor him in his project and whatnot. And then that's when you actually start to see Venezuela making a like a 180-degree turn and going away from the US and closer to Russia, by means of being with Cuba, and then actually
Hmm.
just actually starting to strengthen relationships with what you could today call like an evil axis, because
Right.
it doesn't go just to Russia. You also have Iran there, and then and all kinds of things that are happening. Even actually far in the east, because China is also meddling in there today. But
Hmm.
that's so. I guess my point with all this is the historic relationship between the Venezuela and the U.S. has been very close and it's been very
Hmm.
friendly.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, over the past 30 years, you can make a point that that has deteriorated to the point where you do have, a Venezuelan government or regime, how I would prefer calling it, that's very
Regime.
far away from the U.S.
Yeah.
Now, I wouldn't, I would specify. I wouldn't say, for example, that Venezuelans are inherently, hostile towards the U.S. I see it maybe over time. Some of the new people that have grown up under this regime might be, but historically
Yeah.
Venezuelans have always actually looked up and to the U.S. as a model of where to be, how to act, things to do. It's always been I would
Hmm.
argue it's been a positive relationship.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it has been damaged. So having um, so Venezuela, over the 20th century, like I was saying, I mean Venezuela had a very uh, an amazing development in its oil industry. um, I don't know if some of you might know, but
Hmm.
it's common knowledge that Venezuela does have the largest proven reserves of crude oil in the
Hmm.
world. So Venezuela had a very key role in the formation of OPEC, and
Hmm.
yes, so that actually kind of, and that's one of the ways in which Venezuela after the 70s started to position itself as a key player in the oil
Hmm.
industry at the global level. So with that, Venezuela actually started, and I don't know the details of these, but I can tell you just at a very high level, Venezuela wanted to secure markets that were very important to it.
Hmm.
One of them was, for example, for the U.S. The U.S. had this thing
Yeah.
where even though the U.S. could produce oil and everything, the U.S. just rather buy oil from other countries and put its own oil into reserves. Venezuela was supplying, I'm not going to say all of the oil because the U.S. was also buying from other countries, but Venezuela was definitely supplying. I don't know. I might say something, and
Hmm.
I'm just throwing a
A ball.
ballpark here because I
Yeah.
can't remember the details, but it might be something like 30% or even a little bit more than that. So it was definitely key in supplying oil to the U.S. Plus, it's very close. It's just a short trip from the Caribbean. On top of that, Venezuela had also purchased refineries and built refineries in the Caribbean to kind of like make it easier
Hmm.
to produce the oil from Venezuela, take it into some of the islands, and then from
Hmm.
there take it over to the US. So it was very easy. On the
Uh-huh.
other side, on the other hand, so that's how you can see at some point the creation, or I don't know if Venezuela actually created Citgo or if it purchased it. And this is why I say I don't have the details.
I think I saw somewhere that they purchased a Citgo.
Okay.
I think it was purchased, and then they started to import all of the oil to Citgo, though.
Yeah, so that basically Citgo became Venezuela's presence into the
Hmm.
U.S. oil market, and as you know, Citgo is spread out all over the U.S., so it was definitely securing that relationship, that commercial relationship. Venezuela did
Yeah.
the same in Europe, but in Europe, it did it by way of Germany, I believe. There was a company,
Hmm.
I believe it was called Beva Oil or something of that sort. But Venezuela was basically making sure that. Um, its oil had a market and had a way to be distributed. Um, all of these was working as a very and uh, pun unintended as a well-oiled machine until the arrival of Chavez. Once Chavez got to power, he actually did something that I never thought he would do. I never had a doubt of the project that he had in mind, but I always thought that he would not mess with the oil industry because that was the thing that was keeping the money flowing.
Yeah.
However, obviously that was not at some point it ended up not being part of his project anymore. And in 2002, I believe, after there was a period, a moment where he was ousted for a few days, and there was around that time there was some upheaval in Venezuela. There was a strike, a oil industry strike that
Hmm.
was attempting to put pressure on him to oust him. He didn't like that. He started to see the oil industry as a threat to him, and he ended up firing thousands, literally thousands. I saw this on TV. He did it
Wow.
publicly on TV. He just fired thousands of
Wow.
employees, which were, I mean, these are people that Venezuela had invested many, many, many years and immense amounts of money and resources to form them, to make sure that oil industry was strong. I mean, Venezuela was make I believe was more than 80% of Venezuela's GDP was made up of oil. So it
Wow.
was definitely very important to them. Um, so what happens? He does this, and then he didn't really have a good plan in place to replace all these people. All these
Hmm.
people ended up going to Mexico, Colombia, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, everywhere. Basically, all of Venezuelan competitors in the oil industry, and kind of like took all that knowledge and all those resources with them. And the Venezuelan oil industry started decaying. By the time I moved to the U.S. In 2007, Venezuela was making something around, or maybe even before that, Venezuela got up to something around like s- 3 and some change million barrels of oil a day, which
Wow.
was not the highest production, the highest output of OPEC producers. I believe the countries in the Middle East produce significantly more than that, but it was definitely not anything to laugh at.
Hmm.
It was more than enough to not only supply internal demand. It was more than enough to supply the U.S. It was more than enough to send to Europe, and to have a very robust industry. So when you hear today, just to give you an idea, I mean, I just mentioned that about 15, 16 years ago, we were producing three something millions of barrels a day. Today, the production is around 600,000 a day.
Oh, wow.
So we're
That's
talking,
quite a
we're
bit.
talking. I mean, that was that. It just went down. They said, I was just reading on Forbes that the Maduro regime, when all these talking about getting Venezuelan oil came about, they were saying that they were producing about a million a day, and that's not true. The actual report from OPEC has them around like 660,000. That if you take that amount, um, that quantity of barrels, that doesn't even
Hmm.
supply internal demand. Some of it, I don't know where it goes anymore. Um, for a good amount of time, it was going to Cuba, and it may still be going to Cuba. And
I'm sure
there,
it's still going.
yeah, and I believe there's some part that maybe as payment to Chinese industries, because basically the Maduro regime has been um, selling the country just like if it was, his own property, to different interests, especially Chinese. And the Chinese like to present very attractive offers. They don't really care if you can pay them in cash or not. All they really want is just a way to control you.
Wow.
So I know that at some point there was some information out, and can't remember right now where I had this, but I remember back in Venezuela there was this information flowing around that basically what Chavez back then and then Maduro were doing was just getting money, influx of money from the Chinese,
Mm-hmm.
and what they were doing is that they were promising, they were signing on um, uh, future production of oil to China at a
Wow.
preferential prices. So basically,
No
they
way.
they yeah, it's just it's and then this is no different from what China does. In many other places. That's just the way that they act in their own self-interest, and you can't blame them for that. But it definitely, you can see how that has its detrimental effects in whatever economy
Mm-hmm.
they get into. So so
Wow.
that's basically that's so when today, and I may be getting ahead of myself here because I know you wanted
Oh,
kind of like a historic recount, but that kind
that's
of
okay.
brought us here.
Yeah, of course.
Um, but whenever I heard, it's kind of funny because the way I heard that the Biden administration was thinking about buying oil from Venezuela from my mom. Um, and my mom
Mm-hmm.
tells me, she was like, I don't believe that. I was like, is that true? She wanted me to confirm, and then I open up the Wall Street Journal, and the first thing I see is that, and I'm like, hey, well, I mean, I consider the Wall Street Journal to be a reputable source, so I was like, apparently it's true. And then I started to see it everywhere else, and I actually see the, White House press secretary talking about it, and I'm like, oh well, I guess it's happening. It's a thing. So I thought I was, you know, something that and this is something I try to do myself. I'm not an expert at doing this, but I try my best, and it's whenever I listen to this type of thing, I try to see it
Mm-hmm.
with a cold head. Yes, so
Right.
countries, and when it comes to foreign affairs and international relations, decisions that go into that usually um, are very self-interest oriented.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was trying to think. I was like, well, what could be U.S. self-interest in going into Venezuela? So, thinking here, looking at a silver lining and being absolutely, completely optimistic to the point of being naive, I would say, well, maybe they are aware that Venezuela has fallen outside of their sphere of influence, and maybe this is a way to entice them back and buy them back from Russia and from China, and from the Iranians. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think that's the case. It would take a lot more if you know anything about the Venezuelan regime and how they're made up and how they work and the way they think. You know that this is absolutely not the way that you're gonna bring them back. It's gonna,
Mm.
to begin with, if you wanted to, but the first thing I thought, I was like, there's the first major issue I thought, besides the fact that the U.S. has a $15 million price tag on Maduro's head,
Of course.
it's just something that you need to remember. So now we
Yeah.
have a guy with an actual, he has a $15 million price on his head, to
Mm-hmm.
get, I think it's the DEA that has the price tag on him. And I was like, and now we're gonna buy oil from him. Fantastic.
Oh my
But
goodness. You do
but
that.
if you get past that, you have the issue that Venezuela cannot even supply its own demand anymore. Venezuela, if you look at the news, you can Google this. About a year or two ago,
Hmm.
Iran had to send a ship full of gasoline just so that Venezuela could have gasoline. We're talking about a country that has the largest proven reserves of oil in the
In the
world,
world, yeah.
and they had to get Iran to send them gasoline so that they could subsist. So how can you talk about supply in the US if you cannot even supply your own internal
You're on.
demand? So, and I cannot believe for the life of me that this is something that the Biden administration didn't know. There's is no,
Oh yeah.
unless people were talking to them and they were
They
like,
have
la la la, I don't want to hear you,
yeah.
whatever.
They
It's
have
like, no.
Alzheimer's or something.
So I'm like, how can you possibly think that this is a feasible option? This is
Yeah.
ridiculous. Plus, so let's say that we, you know okay, fine, Venezuela, because I mean, otherwise Venezuela, yes, it makes a lot of sense. Venezuela is like
Yeah.
very close and everything, but all the infrastructure is messed up. On top of that, so that means that you would need, how fast do you think you can get that infrastructure back up so that Venezuela can produce even 1.5 million a day? I would love to hear that. And that's like having everything perfect. There's no corruption. There's, the money gets where it needs to get.
Hmm.
That you get all the people that have the experience and the know-how and everything working back there. And then, so you have that issue. And then the other issue is, how do you ensure that all the Russian meddling that you have in Venezuela, that all the Chinese influence that you have there, but basically the entire axis that is literally trying to wipe
Hmm.
the US off the earth.
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
how can you ensure that these guys don't have any more influence, and that you're basically going to steal Venezuela back? This, which is something that I could argue, and people might tell me that I'm wrong, and that's fine. But I could argue that this is something that, unfortunately, the U.S. has let happen over the past 30 or 40 years. You
Uh
know,
huh.
and I do place some responsibility on the U.S., because whether people like it or not, um, the U.S. is a great power.
Yeah.
And as much as some countries might protest and do everything, in the end, whenever there's a problem, whenever something needs done or anything like that, who do they turn to? The U.S. So,
Hmm.
we do have to acknowledge that the U.S. has had some influence on these countries, and in great part, I would argue again, and I'm probably wrong, but I will argue that the U.S. looking at the Middle East for 30 years, kind of opened up the space for other great powers, or for other
Hmm.
aspiring great powers, to fill in the void that the US left. I mean, I
Right.
won't say that Venezuelans elected Chavez because, and that's the US's fault. That I'm not saying that at all. But I
Uh
am
huh.
saying, what I'm saying is, yeah, barring the responsibility that every country has for its own fate and future, you cannot deny that there are the influence of great powers go a long way. So, maybe things in Venezuela could have not gotten as bad as they are, and maybe Russia would not be as embedded in Venezuela as they are today, or China, had the U.S. maybe be paying attention a little bit more towards its own neighborhood rather than looking at the Middle East, where it had, and this is arguable, I'm sorry, as well.
Arguable.
um
Hmm.
it had an interest, because, yes, I mean, you really cannot fight that the dispute the fact that the U.S. Had to do something about 9/11, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what you can argue is where and how big the action needed to be taken, but that's
Yeah,
that's something that needs to be discussed and at another
of
moment.
course.
And there's a lot of things that I don't know, and that nobody knows, and we'll know later on in the future. Maybe there were some efforts that were misguided, and maybe we could have done something a little bit smaller and a little bit,
Right.
more. But I don't know. But what I'm saying is it had a legitimate reason to look that way. But
Mm-hmm.
maybe we didn't have to keep looking that way and not looking at anything else, because what happens when the US pulls out, when the US pulls back, which is something that we're seeing today,
Mm-hmm.
um, other powers start filling in that void. So,
Yeah.
if it's I am of the thinking that, we might, and I'm sure maybe there's people who are listening to us here that are all about, maybe we should not be looking outside, maybe we should just, keep to ourselves and
Mm-hmm.
look at that. And
Yeah.
that's a very valid point of view.
Point of view. Mm-hmm.
But
Which I agree.
yeah, and but where I'm coming from is the US is a great power nonetheless. And what happens is that great powers do have a role in the world. And when one uh, gets out, another one fills in, and then
Mm,
that's what's happening right now. So the U.S. got out of Venezuela. Now you have China and Russia
China,
right
Russia.
here, right
Mm-hmm.
next to us. And I can tell you about. There's a documentary right now that they've been releasing episodes on YouTube from this guy who has this internationalist here in DC that's been following the Venezuelan situation very closely.
Mm-hmm.
And with the whole cartel war going on right now in Venezuela, in which the Venezuelan army is actually fighting alongside one of the cartels.
Wow, no
Um,
way.
yeah, there's actually like Russian troops engaged in battle there. They're gaining
Wow.
experience. They have tactical advantage over certain areas there where you could arguably they could also be using them to spy on Colombians, which
Mm-hmm.
Colombia is a staunch ally of the US, at least up to this point. We don't know what's going to happen in the next elections, but that's the part where I say, well, what would I rather have? The U.S. maybe looking a little bit outside and making sure that things stay calm in this side of the world, or do I want to have China and Russia right there? I will go with the U.S. influence any
Mm.
day. So and that's my argument for that. That's not to say that whoever thinks that the U.S. needs to look more inward is wrong. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
saying that at all. I think that's a very good argument, and we could very well do that, but we would have
Mm-hmm.
to deal with other great powers filling in, and then the consequences that will bring.
Yeah, and yeah, all I think about is the consequences that it would bring doing these type of deals with Venezuela currently. I actually pulled up an article that talks about that. It's from NPR.
Hmm.
NPR portrays itself to be, I guess, not leftist, but at the same time a little moderate on what they, the information that they publish to the
Hmm.
public. And then yeah, I will go ahead and make a little bit of a comment on what you were talking about, in regards of that. And but yeah, like I said, China definitely makes me very nervous though.
You should.
And yeah, yeah, in the here in the U.S. we gosh, we're trying. I don't know, and I'm not speaking for myself. Our administration and the media is trying to make us look weak. But on the other hand, it is my understanding, as per other individuals in overseas, they see us as super strong, and they are afraid of us. So it's basically like like a mute feeling, kind of like a mutual feeling in between countries that like he's very strong, I need to be strong.
Oh yeah,
So
absolutely,
so
absolutely, and I mean, this is part of what international relations are, right? And
yeah.
certainly, if you look back to the Cold War, right? The main adversary was the Soviet Union, and if you asked anybody at that point, dude, you can actually
Hmm.
see it in pop culture. If you
Yeah.
ever watched any of the Rocky Balboa movies,
Yeah.
when Rocky faces Drago
Yeah.
is this monster who's like 8 feet tall and full of steroids, and he killed Apollo just just
Yeah.
with his own hands. That's the way that Americans looked at Russians at that point, like these
Yeah.
immense force and whatnot, and then ended up crumbling, right? And the U.S. emerges as this, the winner basically of the Cold War. And if you look right now, we still kind of had that idea about Russia, about this decaying power, but
Hmm.
they're still very strong. And what we're seeing today in Ukraine is that maybe not so much. They're I mean, their performance has been very poor at best. That's not to say that we would want to get into a shooting war with them, but that they're definitely not as strong as a lot of people thought they would be. But that's just a normal thing about international relations, especially when it comes to these big power relationships. If you look at China, for example, I do agree with you. Um,
Hmm.
and actually, I'm a big fan of this. There's this American author he's an eminence, and when it comes to international relations, he's an academic by the name of John Mersheimer.
Hmm.
He's one of the main proponents of a view of the world of the international relations. Is called realism. I don't
Hmm.
know if it's neo-realist or whatever. But realism, basically,
Yeah.
is a very uh, pessimistic way of looking at the world, but that it has a lot of true in it. And some of the main tenets of realism is that countries will act in their own self-interest, and it also talks about the fact that whenever you don't want the other guy to get too strong, because when the
Yeah.
other guy gets too strong, he may want to fight you.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
that's some of the tenets. And he argues, you can look it up online. If you look at Mersheimer on China, he argues that the U.S. shouldn't have helped China at all, or maybe not as much as it did over the
Hmm.
past 40 years, because basically he argues that the US was creating this monster that China is becoming.
Wow.
Now, to put some things into perspective, and I'm not saying that he's right, but I do see that he has a point. Because as much as the US has helped China, because China would not be where it is without the US. And even
Correct.
today, as much as there might be political, bickering and everything, all of that, both countries have a lot to lose when it comes to financial, um, the financial relationship and commercial relationship between both of them. But if you put things into perspective, I mean,
Hmm.
China looks at the U.S. As a decaying power. The U.S. look at China as a rising power.
Yeah.
The U.S. continues to have a larger economy. I believe China by this point is about 70% as rich as the U.S., which is a lot to say for the U.S.
Hmm.
being a country of 300 and some million people, and China being a country of like 1.5 billion or something like that. So
A
that means that
billion
the
and a half.
U.S. Yeah, the U.S. has a lot of economical power. I mean, it still
Yeah.
has a larger economy. The U.S. military is still considered to be stronger and more far-reaching than the Chinese is, but the Chinese is getting there too. Um,
Yeah.
and so the U.S. still has, you could argue that the U.S. still has the upper hand, but some say, especially like Mersheimer, that that will not last for very long. And what he says is that at some point we are bound to collide. Maybe not tomorrow, but very soon. So he's been arguing for the past 20 or 30 years after the end of the Cold War that we need to pay attention to China, and not so much to Russia, not so much to the Middle East. I'm not
Hmm.
saying that he's right. I'm just saying that he's one of these guys who's been saying this, and I believe he has a lot of things that you need to pay attention to. So I do believe that China is the next one. Uh, I don't know that we're gonna enter a war with them.
Hmm.
Those are things that you never know. You never,
Yeah.
nobody thought that Putin was gonna do this thing, because it was
Right.
irrational for him to do it. Even though some might argue that it was a rational move, but it ended up not really being one. But yes, I mean, we do need to look at China. Maybe. Not so much to not so much to see them. You could see them as a competitor if you don't want to use
Hmm.
you don't want to be violent. We don't have to fight them. It's just that but we should pay attention to them. We should not let them get the upper hand, because they can become dangerous. And
Yeah.
they are and this is a part where I take, when it comes to the United States, I much rather have the US influence over any other country's influence, or at least over a country like Russia or communist China, because the
Hmm.
US, um, the US is this beacon of liberal democracy. And when I say
Yeah.
liberal, I'm not saying liberal in the context that is used today,
Correct.
talking about the political parties. I'm talking about
Right.
liberal values like, the freedom, and democracy, and all of these. And the US has been very good at doing that. And because of that, in great part, you have today, a rise in human rights around the world. And the US has played a big part in multilateralism.
Hmm.
As good or bad as you might think it is, it's still something notable. And then
Correct.
when you see, for example, the influence of in the US had in the reconstruction of Europe after World War II. Where is Europe today? You see
Yeah.
the European Union. You see a thriving economy. You see countries that are doing well.
Because they
When you
learned.
see Yes, and the U.S. had a lot to do with that. When you see Japan today, how is Japan today? That had a lot to do with the U.S. But then when you see, for example, countries where Russia was involved, look at Cuba. Where is Cuba today? Can you
Yeah.
compare it to Japan or to
No.
Germany? No.
None whatsoever.
So, and I would say, I would argue that's a very good gauge. That you can take that as a way to measure, what kind of influence do you really want in this world, right? um and so to me, that's why I do believe in the let's say, like a positive influence that the US can have, and should continue to have, so that we don't have this all this madness going around with
Hmm.
these guys. So, but yeah, I mean, just to say that I do believe. I mean, I think Russia, with everything that's going on, I actually believe that this might be the end of this guy, of Putin, with all these crazy things that he decided to
Yeah.
do. I might be wrong, but I believe that this is doing more harm to him than any good. um, and then so we should still look at him, but I do believe that we really need to focus on
Hmm.
China and what China is doing.
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah, definitely. I'm there with you. We really need to be careful with what China is currently doing and kind of like monitor their actions. And if we and also, well, and another thing that I'm going to stress about a lot is the fact that there are U.S. officials that are siding with China, and I'm saying that with a lot of responsibility, because there are officials. When you see there are blue states and red states, and there are purple states. So in order to gain states, as far as voting is concerned, then there are officials. I mean that definitely side with. It definitely looks like they're going either woke, one way or the other. Giving money, for that, or siding with things that will benefit with China. So right there. I mean, you may or may not agree with with that statement or call it conspiracy theory, but up to this point, gosh, I mean, everything nowadays it's I don't know. It just makes me feel that there's something going on out there, and China really wants to have power over, over what we believe, and cancel the culture that that we currently have. And us as Latinos, you're from Venezuela and I'm from Mexico. So the point that I want to come across is the fact that we came here to escape politics, bad politics. We escaped, and I don't know about you, but we came here for a better future for our families and for ourselves. And it seems like it's kind of like chasing us around. So that's one comment that I wanted to make. But the article that I wanted to show here is
Mhm.
from NPR, and yeah, the plans that Biden has in order to side with Venezuela, and apparently there's another declaration by Biden that says President Biden said he will designate Colombia as a major non-NATO ally, telling Private Ivan Duque during a White House visit that Colombia is the essential partnership we need in this hemisphere. I mean, you probably might be able to tell us a little bit more about that because, well, your wife is Colombian and she has a really good notion of what is going on in Colombia. Um, yeah, go ahead.
I did want to touch on something before I go to that. I wanted to touch on what you were saying before about the influence China has on some U.S. officials. I wonder to say that that is true because I don't know about it.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't tell you a particular instance of that. However, I will say that it's not. Um, it's not unreasonable to think that that could be happening. And the reason
Mm-hmm.
why is because we all know that our politicians today are very susceptible to the influence of um, uh, big financiers and economic power. They have a need to
Mm-hmm.
finance their campaigns and push their agendas and whatnot. And then
Yeah.
you have and definitely that's a way in which you could see some sort of Chinese influence. You definitely see it today in other areas. You can see it with the
Mm-hmm.
NBA, having to kind of like walk back whenever the protests were going on in Taiwan,
Yeah.
and they because they make so much money in China, they kind of had to like, take a step back whenever some players were talking in support of the people in Taiwan. You could even see it with like John Cena
Oh.
issuing an
Mm-hmm.
apology in Mandarin after doing something that he thought was right, and I think it was right to support the struggle of the people in Taiwan. But he does have, those financial ties in
Mm-hmm.
China, and ended up having to do that. So it's not
Yeah.
unreasonable to think that there might be some influence there as well, and that we should be particularly attentive to that. When it comes to the U.S. and its partnership with Colombia, that's something that I actually do look at with very good eyes. And you can see that the ties between both countries are very strong. Actually, even actually not like the part that I see the most, and I don't have any special knowledge of this in particular. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
beyond the fact that I do talk to my wife about this kind of stuff, and I mean, but she
Right.
she has the knowledge that that a regular Colombian would have on these type of matters. She doesn't have any access to any privileged information, but you can look at this if you go on Instagram and you look at if the Colombian army has a very good, very active presence in Instagram,
Mm-hmm.
and they like to showcase what they do and all of this good stuff. And the amount of interaction when it comes to training that they do with the
Mm-hmm.
U.S. Army, especially with the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force. That's not to say that they don't do it with the other branches, but most of what I've seen
Yeah.
has been the Army and the Air Force. It's amazing. It's amazing. I mean, we're talking. Actually, if you look at, they have one of their like high speed, like very capable type of um, forces that they have
Mm-hmm.
over there. They're called the Lanceros. They're
Uh-huh.
actually modeled after the Green Beret School in the of the U.S. Army. That's the Special Forces level, and I mean, and these guys are using NATO regulation
Mm-hmm.
weapons, uniforms, like pretty much. Well, I don't know their uniforms, but I do
Right.
know that they use NATO weapons, and they use also they're getting training. I mean, not very long ago they were training with 82nd Airborne, in some exercises and all of that, and it's basically all getting in line with NATO, even though they're not officially part of NATO. They're like one of these. They don't. This isn't one of these statuses where they're kind of like an
Yeah.
informal ally. But I believe I mean, Colombia is a very good ally to have, and there's a
Yeah.
lot of alignment when it comes to U.S. Commercial presence in Colombia, as well as the collaboration that they have in
Mm-hmm.
law enforcement and military issues. So I believe, I mean,
Good.
if the Biden administration looks at strengthening that relationship or anything, I believe that's a very good thing to do. And it would be awesome if they could also do that with some other countries, but Colombia for sure. And this is not new. I mean, Colombia has been aligned with the U.S. for a long time.
For a long time. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, they've been great allies though. And another thing that I wanted to kind of like talk a little bit about is in order to side with Venezuela, Biden also has arranged the release of some captive Citgo officials, and he talks about this in the article that I'm showing here. Is that Venezuela's oil industry has become entwined with Russia, particularly since U.S. sanctions on Caracas shut the door to oil trade with Russia, now heavily sanctioned over the invasion with Ukraine. American officials saw a unique environment to advance U.S. national security interests, a senior administration official said after the visit. The two Americans long detained in Venezuela were released. The first one is Gustavo Cardenas,
Hmm.
one of six executives of gas company Citgo arrested during a 2017 work trip and later charged with corruption.
Correct.
The other one, Jorge Alfredo Fernandez, a Cuban American man arrested on separate charges last year. So, is what are your thoughts about this type of strategy that Biden is doing in order to, and this will be kind of like the last question because we're running out of time here.
Okay.
What do you think Biden is doing the right moves
No.
here?
No, that's an easy answer for me because to begin with, I did see about the official position of the Biden administration is that this release of these two American citizens was not had nothing to do with the talks, but
Hmm.
that's what they say. I don't believe in coincidences when it comes to this type of stuff, but
Right.
they're basically attributing it to a coincidence that they had been working on this thing, and then it just so happened
Hmm.
that they released these two guys as these talks were going on. It is important to notice that this was the first time the U.S. had actually officially traveled to Venezuela to meet
Hmm.
the regime since, like, I can't remember. I think it was like 1999 or something like that. So
Yeah,
it's a
it's been a long
very
time.
high level type of thing. And
Hmm.
no, no. To begin with, I mean, if we're looking at that, the U.S. Um, has this long-standing policy of not um, negotiating um, with what you call it.
Hmm.
Trading no, I mean, not trading hostages, but not you know I
The
remember
releasing
right now
of.
the yeah, the US doesn't really doesn't like to do that kind of thing of, like, I'll give you this and you give me people back. And
Hmm.
right now the word is escaping me, because that basically incentivizes that type of behavior. It's like, oh, okay, well,
Yeah.
yeah, I can get stuff if I release people, so let me go kidnap more people. So the US doesn't usually
Right.
at least that's like the official stance that you kind of see with the U.S. take. But these kind of look like it happened that way, and I'm not saying it did, but I'm just saying, it's not
Hmm.
unreasonable to think that that may have happened. And I think definitely that's a wrong sign.
Yeah.
And then these two were not the only ones that were captured during that trip. There's about four more. So why do you release two and not the other four? Are you waiting for something else so that you can release the other four? So it's just something to think about. And the other thing, beyond the fact that you're dealing with extortionists, because
Hmm.
that's what they are. Then is the fact that it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense, because if we go ahead and we make this deal happen, the gas prices are not going to go down because Venezuela can't even
Yeah.
supply it. So,
Wow.
how long is it going to take? We're going to have to put more money into it. And then who? China's going to steal that technology, that knowledge, or Russia will. It will probably be used to fund, because Venezuela is going to have to give money back to Russia and money back to China. So all that money that you're giving them is probably going to be used against you. So it just doesn't make any
Hmm.
sense. If you want that relationship to work, Venezuela has to have a democratic government for real, not this sham
Hmm.
that you see today. So
Right.
no, that's my answer. No, it doesn't make any sense. I don't think it's a good move,
Right.
and I actually don't think it's gonna happen. It actually found a lot of opposition on both parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. And I see this as a very positive sign, and that's probably why we're not hearing much more about it.
Right. Yeah. That definitely makes sense what you're talking about. And gosh, everything that this guy in office is currently doing is just messing. It's messing with our relationships with other countries. Is messing with the economy. Definitely a desire, and I think it's even worse than Obama. Of how things are going. But anyway, that's just another story. But anyway, well, thank you so much, Alex. It was definitely a pleasure to have you here today in at the Nacho Show, and we definitely are going to go ahead and do another episode because there's so much to talk about, and that's for sure.
Oh, there's a lot. There's a lot going on. Thank you for having me. I like the new layout of the show. It's very nice.
Oh, thank you.
So yeah, no, absolutely, anytime.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stefan. And well, thank you, folks, for being here today. I definitely appreciate all of you being here at the Nacho Show. And remember, this show is being sponsored to you by Solidify Web. We will bring a website for you today, and nachographics.com. And remember, run for office if you're a conservative. Make sure that you are defending the Constitution of the United States. And we will see you next time.